This graph depicts the demand schedule that we've discussed in class. Remember that when we were talking about demand, we talked about price and we talked about quantity. We also understood that as part of this process, that these were the only two conditions that applied. When we talked about the term known as ceteris paribus, which meant all things being held constant at a given point in time, we knew that that meant that price was the only change that was going to occur, and that all other factors were held constant. In other words, there was no tendency for change. Given that this was the situation, we also knew from our demand curve that the relationship that occurred with price and quantity was an inverse relationship. You remember, if we looked at any given price point, we saw that we could pick a price point, we could move it out to the demand curve, and that would show us what sort of quantity we had. And you can see from these points that if we were to give them numbers, we said $1, $2 perhaps, and $3. And at a price of $3, a consumer was only prepared to consume 50 units. At a price of $2, a consumer felt that they could consume 100 units. And at a price of $1, you can see that in each of those cases, that the lower the price becomes, the greater the quantity demanded. And therefore, the reverse is also true. The higher the price, the less a consumer is prepared to buy. So at each of those points, the important thing for us to consider was what was actually happening to the consumption or the quantity demanded at each of those price levels. And where ceteris paribus is the condition that applies, you can see that the points move along the demand curve. So we have what's known as a movement. And this movement can be in two forms. It can either be in an increasing direction, so it's moving down the curve, in which case we know that to be an expansion of demand. On the other hand, we can also see that as the price rises and so the quantity reduces, we then have a movement back along the curve, and this is known as a contraction. In other words, the quantity demanded by consumers has contracted rather than expanded, which we saw as the price moved downwards. The other thing that we need to remember about this is that we also knew that in a demand curve there were two particular conditions that applied. One was the ceteris paribus, which was price was the only one that affected what happened in relation to the quantity a consumer would demand at a given price point. The other, of course, related to non-price factors. And in this case, we can see that this changes what we're looking at. So we have non-price factors which create the next set of conditions. And you remember that non-price factors were those things other than price which affected the way consumers behaved. And it could have been to do with tastes and fashions which changed. And you will also remember that when we talked about that, we said that those sorts of things related in particular to clothing, and in particular to women's clothing, which was very much focused on fashion at the time. It also relates to substitutes. So if you think about tea and coffee or butter and margarine, sometimes there is a problem with the supply of those particular ingredients in the market, and if that occurs, then the substitute will take over. Suddenly the coffee crop fails and there is no coffee at all, as supply dwindles to the market, so people will look for an alternative. And the same applies to tea. And a classic example of tea is the rise of different types of teas which you see on the market now. So not everybody just drinks black tea. There are green teas, there are herbal teas. Those are what we call substitutes. So thinking about the non-price factors, what we're interested in is in fact the change that occurs to our demand curve. So if we start at D1 and we have a situation whereby we have our equilibrium point, and you remember that equilibrium was the point at which the market would clear itself, that is, everything that people demanded in terms of consumption was taken at that particular price point. There was no shortage and there was no surplus. And remember again that if we moved along this curve in any direction, we had a movement, and that movement could have been a contraction of demand, in which case it would have been going this way, and if there was an increase, then we would have had an expansion of the market just at that point. What happens now with price factors is that these change and it creates a shift in the curves. So a curve can shift to the right or it can shift to the left. So we'll label these as shifts. And in this case, it creates what we call an increase or a decrease. And it means at this point that the non-price factors, remembering that it's not just price anymore, it's other factors included, have moved what occurs in quantity. But on this occasion, you can see that if we were to take our point out here, something's changed. We've had an increase in the level. The sorts of things that are likely to cause this are additional resources which may have come into the market, an excess which may have come in technology, which may have also allowed us to increase more, but no consequent price change. And on the other side, you can see if there was a change in non-price factors which adversely affect consumption, then you can see here that it's decreased. And that could have been due to such things as the failure in the coffee crop. The supply is no longer available, and so there is less available to the market. The whole of the market for coffee has the potential to decrease like that. So those are the important things that we need to think about in relation to just the demand curve. It supports what we've talked about in class in terms of ceteris paribus conditions, which we saw in the first of our graphs, and the non-price factors which we saw in this second graph. And we need to make sure that we recognise the difference between these two things. Remembering the axes do not change. It's the curves that are going to change depending on our two sets of conditions.